Snickers rippled through the cattle auction the moment the girl's bid card went up. 12 years old, standing on her toes to be seen over the rail, she just placed a serious bid on a bred heifer worth more than most trucks in that parking lot. A few ranchers nearby exchanged amused glances, certain someone would step in and correct the mistake. Yes, this really happened. She really did bid. And the auctioneer, reading her registration card aloud, really did stop everything the moment he recognized her father's name. Comment below and tell me where you're watching this from. Grace Callahan had been coming to this auction barn in eastern Colorado since before she could walk, trailing behind her father on sale days while he built a small but respected cattle operation from almost nothing. Her father, Tom Callahan, wasn't a wealthy man by any measure, but he'd earned a reputation in the local ranching community for something harder to buy than money. His word meant something, and he'd spent 2 decades proving it, one handshake deal at a time. 6 months earlier, a logging accident on a neighbor's property had put Tom in a hospital bed with injuries that kept him from working the ranch, let alone attending an auction. The family's small herd had shrunk over the following months as medical bills piled up faster than the ranch could cover them. Grace, watching her mother stretch every dollar and her father grow quieter with each passing week, decided she wasn't going to just watch it happen. She'd been saving money since she was 8 years old, money from odd jobs, from selling eggs at the farmer's market, from a modest 4-H stipend she'd earned raising and showing her own calf 2 years running. It wasn't a fortune, but combined with a small inheritance her grandmother had left specifically in her name, it was enough, she calculated carefully, to bid seriously on a single bred heifer that could start rebuilding her family's herd. Her mother hadn't wanted her going alone, but with Tom still in physical therapy and her mother juggling his appointments alongside the ranch's remaining chores, Grace insisted she could handle the auction herself. She was old enough, she argued, to have learned exactly what her father had taught her about reading an animal, judging a fair price, and knowing when to hold steady on a bid. Walking up to the registration table that morning, Grace filled out her paperwork in careful handwriting, listing her father's ranch as the buyer of record since the purchase would technically go through the family's registered brand. The clerk at the table glanced at the name on the form, paused for half a second longer than necessary, then said nothing and handed back a bidder number. Grace didn't think much of that pause. She found a seat near the front of the barn, heifer catalog open on her lap, circling the specific lot number she'd researched for weeks, a young cow with strong bloodlines and a manageable price range, exactly the kind of animal her father would have picked himself. The targeted heifer came up for bidding around mid-morning, and Grace's hand went up almost immediately when the opening number matched what she'd calculated she could afford. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through a cluster of ranchers standing near the rail, a few of them exchanging glances, clearly assuming a kid's raised hand was some kind of mix-up the auctioneer would sort out. The auctioneer, a long-time fixture at this particular sale barn, paused his rhythm just slightly, glancing toward Grace's seat before continuing the call. A rancher 2 rows back leaned toward his neighbor and murmured something about somebody's daughter playing around, loud enough for a few nearby seats to hear. Before we get to the moment that silenced that entire section of the barn, hit subscribe, because what happened next turned a dismissed 12-year-old's bid into something nobody in that building expected. Grace kept her hand steady as the price climbed, matching each increment the auctioneer called without hesitation. A couple of casual bidders dropped out quickly, uninterested in pushing further against what they assumed was a child testing her luck. But Grace didn't fold, and the bidding kept climbing toward the range she'd calculated as her actual ceiling. At the next lull in bidding, the auctioneer's assistant walked her registration card up to the podium for a routine mid-auction verification, standard practice whenever a bid climbed high enough to warrant confirming the buyer's information matched the account on file. The auctioneer glanced down at the card, reading the name printed beneath Grace's own signature, the ranch's official name, followed by Callahan Livestock, Tom Callahan, owner. His hand paused mid-motion, gavel hovering rather than falling on the current bid. He looked up, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on Grace sitting near the front, catalog still open on her lap. Waiting patiently for the next call, he asked her, directly and clearly enough for the whole barn to hear, whether Tom Callahan was her father. Grace nodded, unsure why the question mattered enough to stop the entire auction. The auctioneer set the gavel down on the podium without finishing the current call, and for the first time since she'd walked into that barn that morning, the room went completely quiet. every eye shifting toward the 12-year-old girl they'd been quietly dismissing just minutes earlier. Stepping slightly away from his microphone, the auctioneer asked if he could speak to Grace directly before continuing, and the barn watched, murmuring quietly, as he walked around the podium toward her seat. He introduced himself properly this time, telling her his name was Hank Dunmore, and that he'd known her father for nearly 15 years through this very sale barn. Then he told a story most of the room had never heard, one that clearly still weighed on him. 8 years earlier, Hank explained, a brutal winter storm had wiped out nearly a third of his own herd overnight. An financial blow that nearly cost him the small ranch he'd spent his whole life building. At the time, he'd been too proud and too embarrassed to ask anyone in the ranching community for help, quietly resigning himself to selling off what remained just to cover his losses. Tom Callahan, without ever making it a public gesture, had shown up at Hank's property that same week with a trailer of his own cattle alone. Tom had insisted, not a gift, though he never once brought up repayment in all the years since. That quiet act had kept Hank's ranch afloat through the worst stretch of his life, and he'd never forgotten it, even though Tom himself rarely mentioned it to anyone. Hank hadn't recognized Grace by sight, he admitted, but the moment he saw Tom Callahan's name printed on that registration card, the entire memory came rushing back at once. The same quiet generosity, showing up again 8 years later in his own daughter, sitting in that barn trying to save her family's herd the exact same way her father had once saved his. His voice caught slightly as he turned back toward the crowd and explained, loud enough for everyone to hear, exactly who Tom Callahan was and what he'd quietly done for this community over the years. Gestures most people in that barn had never known about, because Tom had never wanted credit for any of them. Turning back to Grace, Hank told her the remaining balance on her bid, an amount that had climbed past what her savings alone could fully cover, would be handled personally by him, a debt long overdue and finally within reach of repaying. The heifer, he said, was hers. The barn that had been quietly laughing at a 12-year-old girl less than 20 minutes earlier now sat in stunned, moved silence. Several ranchers visibly wiping their eyes as the full weight of what they'd just witnessed settled over the room. Applause started slowly, uncertain at first, then built steadily as people around the barn processed what had just happened. Ranchers who had scoffed at Grace's raised hand less than half an hour earlier now stood clapping, several making their way over afterward to shake her hand or quietly apologize for assuming the worst. Hank kept his word. The heifer was loaded and ready for transport by early afternoon, and Grace called her mother from the parking lot, voice shaking as she tried to explain everything that had happened in a single rushed, emotional phone call. Her mother drove straight to the sale barn, arriving just as several local ranchers were already offering to help haul the animal home themselves. Word of what happened spread through the ranching community within days, eventually reaching a small regional agricultural paper that ran a short feature on the story. People wanted to know more about Tom Callahan, the quiet acts of kindness that had apparently gone unspoken for years, and the daughter who had unknowingly carried his legacy into that same sale barn without realizing what she was walking into. For Grace's family, the heifer meant far more than a single animal added back to a shrinking herd. It meant the beginning of rebuilding what medical bills and months of lost income had steadily chipped away at, and one less thing weighing on her father as he continued recovering. Her mother later said, the moment reminded her exactly why she'd fallen in love with Tom all those years ago, a man who helped people quietly, expecting nothing in return, and rarely mentioned it even to his own family. Hank, for his part, said the moment reminded him why small ranching communities still mattered the way they did. A debt he'd carried quietly for 8 years had finally come full circle, arriving in the most unexpected way possible, through the daughter of the man who'd once saved his ranch without asking for a single thing in return. Grace still helps run that growing herd today, older now, having learned firsthand that a good reputation, built quietly over years, can travel further and land more powerfully than anyone expects. What started as a room full of adults dismissing a 12-year-old's bid turned into something far bigger, a story about kindness passed forward, arriving exactly when a family needed it most. A dismissed 12-year-old's bid turned out to be honoring a debt she never even knew existed. Her father's quiet kindness came back 8 years later, exactly when his family needed it most. If this story moved you, subscribe for more real moments where kindness quietly comes full circle.